February 28, 2017. A house in the woods of upstate New York. A fire. A 16-year-old boy still in his bed, both parents outside. Firefighters found his body burned beyond recognition. The autopsy found something else. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly what was missing from that boy's lungs, and what it proved about the two people who were supposed to protect him. Past the Catskills, in the rolling hills and woods of south-central New York, there are small towns tucked into the landscape like afterthoughts. One of them is the town of Guilford in Shenango County, about 90 minutes southeast of Syracuse. Population, a few thousand. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, where doors go unlocked, where the biggest events of the year are leaf season in the fall and the silence of winter. Guilford sits just to the north of Sydney, a slightly larger town of about 5,000 people, and the two communities share that particular rhythm of life that defines rural upstate New York. Slow, predictable, and shaped by the seasons. In the summer, tourists come for the rivers and the hiking trails. In the autumn, the leaf peepers fill the country roads with out-of-state plates. But in winter, between late November and early March, there is almost nothing. The towns go quiet, the roads empty. The houses sit behind walls of snow and bare trees, separated from each other by stretches of woodland and farmland that make every property feel like its own small island. If something happens in one of these houses in the middle of winter, at 1 in the morning on a Tuesday, the chances of anyone seeing it, hearing it, or knowing about it are close to zero. That isolation is part of what makes this part of the state beautiful. It is also part of what made the Franklins think they could get away with what they did. On State Highway 8, down a winding road that runs alongside the Unadilla River, sits a house. Or it did. By the morning of March 1st, 2017, it is nothing but charred wood, melted siding, and ash. The fire that consumed it was massive, flames shooting 20 feet into the air, visible from across the hills, turning the snow orange for hundreds of yards in every direction. By the time firefighters arrived, there was nothing left to save. But inside the ruins, in what had been a back bedroom, they found a body. It was burned beyond all recognition. Dental records and other identifying markers would confirm what everyone already feared. The body belonged to Jeffrey Franklin. He was 16 years old. He was deaf. He was autistic. He could not speak. He wore diapers. He could not be left alone. He was found in his bed, in the position of someone who had been sleeping. The house itself was a double-wide trailer that had been modified and added onto over the years. It sat on a wooded lot along State Highway 8, set back from the road, with few neighbors in any direction. The nearest house belonged to the Gildersleeve family, across the road and down a slight hill. Beyond that, woods. The fire had been so intense that by the time the first trucks arrived, the structure was fully involved. A term firefighters use when there is nothing left to protect. The walls had collapsed inward. The roof was gone. Anything inside that house, furniture, clothing, paperwork, photographs, and the body of a 16-year-old boy, had been subjected to temperatures that destroy almost everything. Almost. The word almost would turn out to matter enormously. Outside the burning house that night stood his adoptive parents, Ernest Franklin, 35, and Heather Franklin, 33. Ernest was calm. Heather arrived later, after the fire had already consumed the structure. Neither of them had burns. Neither of them had smoke on their clothes. Neither of them had any injuries suggesting they had tried to get inside. And when firefighters asked if anyone was in the house, the Franklins did not mention Jeffrey right away. They asked about the animals first. It was only when firefighters pressed them directly, "Is there anyone inside?" that they said yes. Their son. Back bedroom. The source of the fire was traced to the wood-burning stove in the main living area. Ernest told investigators he had lit the stove earlier that evening to warm the house, left the stove door open, and then gone outside to chase after the family's 2 dogs, which had gotten loose. While he was out in the cold, the fire spread. By the time he smelled smoke and turned around, the house was already engulfed. Heather was not home. She said she had left around 11:30 that night to go buy Benadryl, an over-the-counter sleep aid, because she could not sleep. This being late on a Tuesday in rural upstate New York, she had to drive to several stores before finding one that was open. It was a tragedy, a devastating accident. A young boy with special needs trapped in a burning house while his father was outside and his mother was at the store. The community responded the way small communities do. A neighbor named Dominic Gildersleeve, who lived across from the Franklins and had been woken by Ernest pounding on his grandmother's door that night, created a GoFundMe page to help the family get back on their feet. Donations poured in. More than $11,000. Friends dropped off food, clothing, supplies. Heather posted on Facebook about how lost she felt without JR, that was Jeffrey's nickname, and how the community's love and support had been overwhelming. She set up a gift registry for items they needed to replace. It looked like grief. It sounded like grief. But there were people who were watching more carefully, and what they saw did not add up. Dominic Gildersleeve was one of the first people at the scene that night. He had known Ernest for years. They were neighbors, friends. He had called 911. He had run outside to help. And standing there in the chaos, watching the house burn, he noticed something that began to eat at him. Heather never asked about Jeffrey, not once. She arrived after the fire was fully engulfed. She asked Ernest what they were going to do. She asked about the animals. She asked about the house. But she did not ask about her son. Not where he was. Not whether he had gotten out. Not whether he was alive. Ernest was the same. When Heather pulled up, Ernest walked over and put his arms around her. But he did not look at her. He did not speak. He stared off into the distance with no expression on his face. Dominic described it as blank. There was nothing there. No emotion at all. And then there was the matter of Heather's midnight errand. She left the house to buy Benadryl. She did not have a driver's license. When Dominic saw her pull up in the car, his first thought was, "What are you doing driving?" And here was the other thing. Their dogs were outdoor dogs. They came and went on their own. Every single time those dogs came home by themselves. Ernest said he went outside to chase them. He had never needed to do that before. Dominic stopped sharing the GoFundMe. He stopped promoting it. He quietly stepped away from the family. Ernest and Heather, however, kept that share button going. Think about what investigators are looking at. A house fire that killed a 16-year-old boy who could not move, could not call for help, could not hear an alarm. A father who says he was outside chasing dogs that always come home on their own. A mother who says she was out buying medicine she apparently did not buy. Neither parent with any burns or injuries. Neither parent asking about their son at the scene. And a community raising thousands of dollars for a couple whose story does not hold together. There was another detail that investigators noted early on. Ernest Franklin had no burns on his body, no smoke damage on his clothing, no singed hair, no redness on his skin. Nothing. If a man had been close enough to his house to see it engulfed in flames, close enough to realize his son was trapped inside, and had made any attempt whatsoever to get through a door or a window, there would be evidence of that attempt on his body. Burns on the hands, blisters on the arms, smoke in the nostrils, soot on the face. Ernest had none of it. Not a mark. He told investigators he tried to get back into the house but could not get close because of the heat. But firefighters who arrived shortly after said the fire had already been burning for some time by the point they got there, meaning Ernest had been outside long enough to watch the entire house become consumed without ever getting close enough to sustain a single injury. Either he never tried to save his son, or he was never near the house when the fire started. Both possibilities pointed in the same direction. The Chenango County Sheriff's Office was already suspicious. From the very first moments at the scene that night, red flags had gone up. But they chose to keep it close, to let the investigation develop quietly while the Franklins believed they had gotten away with it. Then the autopsy results came back. and everything changed. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Jeffrey Franklin's body found no soot in his lungs, no smoke in his mouth, no smoke in his trachea, no smoke in his bronchi, no carbon monoxide buildup in his blood. When a person dies in a fire, they breathe. Even if they are unconscious, even if they are asleep, the body's respiratory system continues to function. Smoke enters the airways, soot coats the lungs. Carbon monoxide saturates the blood. These are the markers that tell a medical examiner that a person was alive when the fire was burning around them. Jeffrey Franklin had none of these markers. Zero. His lungs were clean. There was only one explanation. Jeffrey was already dead when the fire started. He was not breathing when the flames reached his room. He was not alive when the smoke filled the house. Whatever killed Jeffrey Franklin, it was not the fire. The fire was set afterwards to destroy the evidence of what had actually happened to him. With the autopsy results in hand, investigators began pulling apart every piece of Ernest and Heather Franklin's story. The timeline first. Ernest said he lit the wood stove, left the stove door open, went outside for a few minutes to chase the dogs, and came back to find the house engulfed. Fire investigators analyzed the scene and determined that the timeline did not work. A fire spreading from an open stove door to full engulfment of the structure would take far longer than a few minutes. Ernest had to have been outside for a significant period of time, long enough for the fire to consume the entire house. Either he was lying about how long he was gone, or he was lying about when the fire started. Or both. Heather's story fell apart even faster. She said she went to buy Benadryl. Police tracked her movements through her car's GPS. She drove to a Price Chopper in Sydney, then to a Walmart in Norwich. Prosecutors later presented evidence that in neither store did Heather go to the aisle where Benadryl was located. She did not buy Benadryl at either store. She did not buy anything that matched what she claimed she went out to get. But the GPS told an even more damning story. After leaving the stores, Heather did not drive home. She drove in circles, through Shenango County, through Delaware County, back toward the house, then away again. Looping through the dark, rural roads of upstate New York for hours, killing time, building an alibi, making sure she was far from the house and could account for her whereabouts when the fire was reported. When the Gildersleeves called Heather to tell her the house was on fire, her response was, "Oh, I hope everything's okay." She did not rush home. She did not scream. She did not ask about Jeffrey. She said she hoped everything was okay. The kind of thing you say when someone tells you it might rain tomorrow. Not when someone tells you your house is burning with your son inside. Heather did not return to the scene until 2:18 a.m., more than an hour after the fire was reported. By that time, the house was destroyed. Everything inside was ash. Police also discovered that the Franklin statements changed every time they were questioned. Details shifted. Times moved. They could not agree on basic facts. And there was one detail they both claimed they could not remember. The name of the movie they had watched together that evening before everything happened. They said they watched a movie. They said they could not recall which one. That gap in their story would turn out to be the most important detail of all. To understand why Ernest and Heather Franklin killed their adopted son, you have to understand what was happening behind the carefully curated social media posts and the image of a loving family. Jeffrey Franklin was born deaf and autistic. From birth to age 10, he was passed through 3 different foster families in New York State. By multiple accounts, none of them were good. He went to school with bruises. None of the families taught him sign language, so he had no way to communicate. A deaf child with no language, no voice, no way to tell anyone what was happening to him. He was completely dependent on the adults around him, and the adults around him failed him repeatedly. When Ernest and Heather adopted Jeffrey in 2012, it looked like his life had finally changed. Heather knew sign language. She was ready. They posted about him on social media. Happy photos, proud captions, the look of a family that had found what it was missing. Jeffrey, by all accounts, was a sweet and loving boy. He hugged strangers. He would walk up to people at baseball games and ask for fries. He was full of warmth and affection, despite everything he had been through. But behind the social media posts, the reality was different. Ernest's sister, who visited the house regularly, told police that in public, the Franklins presented a happy family. In private, they treated Jeffrey terribly. They called him a rotten child. They complained that he urinated on the floors, that he drew on the walls, that he was too much work. They made him stand in corners for hours as punishment. They were becoming increasingly frustrated with the demands of caring for a nonverbal, autistic teenager who needed constant supervision. And then Heather got pregnant. After years of trying, after miscarriages and disappointment, Heather was finally expecting a biological child. By February 2017, she was several months along. The pregnancy changed everything. Jeffrey, who had been adopted because Ernest and Heather could not have their own child, was no longer necessary. He was no longer the solution to their desire for a family. He was an obstacle, a burden, a problem that consumed time, energy, and patience that they now wanted to direct toward the baby on the way. Ernest's sister told investigators that she had offered to adopt Jeffrey herself, to take him off their hands, to give him a home where he would be wanted. Ernest and Heather refused. Their reasoning, according to the sister, was that she would bring him back within an hour. They would not give him up, but they would not care for him either. At the scene of the fire, while their son's body lay in the ashes of the house, Ernest's sister said the Franklins seemed more concerned about the $2,000 monthly adoption subsidy they would no longer be receiving than about the boy they had just lost. Within minutes of the fire being extinguished, the money was mentioned. $2,000. Gone. The adoption subsidy was a monthly payment from the state of New York, provided to families who adopt children with special needs. It was meant to offset the additional costs of caring for a child like Jeffrey: medical appointments, specialized equipment, therapists, diapers, and the constant supervision that a nonverbal autistic teenager requires. For Ernest and Heather, that $2,000 a month was a significant portion of their household income. Ernest was not working consistently. Heather stayed home to care for Jeffrey. The subsidy kept them afloat. But with a new baby on the way, their own biological child, the calculus changed. If they kept Jeffrey, the money continued, but so did the exhaustion, the frustration, and the round-the-clock demands of a child they no longer wanted. If they gave Jeffrey back to the state, the money stopped, and they would have to explain to their community why the couple who had so publicly embraced this special needs boy had decided to abandon him. Neither option worked for them, so they chose a third option, one that eliminated the burden, destroyed the evidence, and was supposed to generate sympathy and donations instead of suspicion. Now police had motive. They had a timeline that did not work. They had a mother driving in circles through the night. They had a father with no burns and no emotion. They had an autopsy that proved the boy was dead before the fire. And they had a family that had grown tired of a child they no longer wanted. But they still did not have a confession. When police confronted Ernest and Heather with the evidence, the clean lungs, the GPS data, the inconsistent statements, neither of them admitted to anything. They both lawyered up. Then Ernest made a mistake. In jail, awaiting trial, he became friendly with another inmate. That inmate was a confidential informant, and to this man, Ernest spilled everything. Jeffrey was a burden. They had a new baby coming. They wanted Jeffrey gone, permanently. And they got the idea for how to do it from the movie they watched that night. The movie they conveniently could not remember the name of. The movie was Manchester by the Sea. In the film, which won Casey Affleck an Academy Award, the main character is a man who, while drunk one night, forgets to put the screen in front of the fireplace before leaving the house to buy more beer. A log rolls out. The house catches fire. His 3 children die. He is devastated. He is questioned by police. and he is told that what happened was a tragic accident. Forgetting to put the screen on the fireplace is not a crime. He is not prosecuted. During the trial, the prosecution called multiple witnesses. Dominic Gildersleeve testified about what he saw the night of the fire, the blank look on Ernest's face, Heather's failure to ask about Jeffrey, the dogs that always came home on their own. Ernest's sister testified about the private complaints, the punishment of making Jeffrey stand in corners, the offer to adopt him that was refused, and the comment about the $2,000 subsidy disappearing. The jailhouse informant testified about Ernest's admissions, that Jeffrey was a burden, that the movie gave them the idea, that they wanted him gone. And the medical examiner testified about what he found inside Jeffrey's body. No soot, no smoke, no carbon monoxide. The lungs of a boy who was not breathing when the fire started. The defense called a second pathologist who disagreed with the finding, who argued that the fire damage was so severe that the absence of soot could be explained by the destruction of lung tissue. But the jury did not find this argument persuasive. The prosecution's case was built on too many converging details: the timeline, the GPS, the statements, the informant, the autopsy, for any single alternative explanation to hold. The movie had come out in late 2016 and had been nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It is a deeply sad film about grief, guilt, and the inability to move forward after an unimaginable loss. Casey Affleck's character is not a villain. He is a broken man who made a terrible mistake and has to live with the consequences. The film treats the fire as a tragedy, not a crime. That distinction, accident versus crime, carelessness versus intent, is exactly what Ernest and Heather latched onto. If they could make Jeffrey's death look like the same kind of accident, a wood stove left open, a father who stepped outside for just a moment, a fire that spread too fast, then no one would look any further. The movie gave them a template, a step-by-step blueprint for how to stage a fatal house fire and walk away without being charged. What the movie did not give them was a plan for what happens when a medical examiner opens a body and finds lungs that are perfectly clean. Ernest and Heather watched that movie on the night of February 28, 2017. Within 2 hours of the film ending, Jeffrey was dead and the house was on fire. The parallels were exact. Ernest left the wood stove door open, just as the character in the film left the fireplace screen off. Ernest left the house, just as the character left to buy beer. The fire spread while he was gone. The death was supposed to look like a tragic accident caused by a moment of carelessness. And just like in the movie, no one was supposed to be prosecuted. But Manchester by the Sea is fiction, and in fiction, the medical examiner does not check the victim's lungs for soot. In real life, they do. And in Jeffrey Franklin's lungs, there was nothing. No smoke, no soot, no evidence that he had taken a single breath after the fire started. That was the detail that undid everything. 12 words in an autopsy report. No soot or smoke found in the lungs or airways. That turned a house fire into a murder investigation. Without that finding, Jeffrey Franklin's death would have been ruled an accident. The fire would have explained everything. The Franklins would have collected their GoFundMe money, had their baby, and moved on with their lives. No one would have known. But a body tells the truth even when it is burned beyond recognition. And Jeffrey's body said he was not breathing when the fire reached him. Ernest Franklin was tried first, in March 2019. A jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, arson, and tampering with physical evidence. He was sentenced to 21 years to life in prison. His defense attorney argued that the crime described by prosecutors was too sophisticated for Ernest. The jury disagreed. It took them less than a day to convict. Heather Franklin was scheduled for a separate trial. On the eve of it, in April 2019, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and arson. Prosecutors had contended she was not directly responsible for the killing itself, but she participated in the cover-up, drove in circles to create an alibi, and left her son alone in a house she knew would burn. She was sentenced to 7 to 11 years in prison. While awaiting trial, she had given birth to the child she had been carrying, the biological baby she wanted so badly. The child she would now be unable to raise for most of its childhood. Dominic Gildersleeve, the neighbor who had created the GoFundMe, who had fed the family's animals, who had stood outside that night praying that Jeffrey had gotten out, he said one thing when he learned the truth. He said he had been absolutely, horrifically betrayed. The GoFundMe was taken down. Every donor was refunded. The Chenango County Sheriff called it the first murder in the county that year. He said it was the kind of event that was unfortunately becoming more common. He said what everyone was thinking. Jeffrey was a handicapped person who was totally reliant on his parents. You would hope they would be there for the right reasons. Unfortunately, his life ended brutally. Jeffrey Franklin spent the first 10 years of his life being passed from home to home by people who did not want him. At 11, he was adopted by people who said they did. For 5 years, he had a family. He had a mother who could sign to him. He had a father who called him J.R. He had a house in the woods of upstate New York with dogs and neighbors who knew his name. And then his parents watched a movie. And within 2 hours, the boy who could not hear, could not speak, and could not call for help was dead. The house was in flames, and the 2 people who promised to take care of him were outside, one staring blankly into the fire, the other driving in circles through the dark. His lungs were clean. That is the detail that matters. No smoke, no soot, no breath. The fire did not kill Jeffrey Franklin. The fire was supposed to make sure no one ever found out what did. If this case makes you wonder how many times Jeffrey was failed by the people who were supposed to protect him, from his first foster home to his last, you are not alone. A boy who hugged strangers and asked for fries at baseball games deserved better than every single adult in his life gave him. Drop your thoughts in the comments. There is another case where a parent's story about a child's death fell apart under investigation. But in that case, the evidence was hidden for years, until one detective refused to close the file. That story is next.